Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. So today, we are diving right into a really fascinating panel discussion that recently aired on Fox News, all about the military strikes in the Middle East. We're going to objectively unpack the core arguments, the strategies, and, the harsh geopolitical realities these commentators were debating. Our goal here is just to help you wrap your head around the anatomy of this crisis as it actively unfolds.
Now, to really get why this 10-day military response kicked off the way it did, you have to look at the raw emotional catalyst. It all centers on this direct quote from the president. Every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over. I mean, that is a vow of absolute vengeance, right? It sets a very specific tone. The panel pointed out this isn't your standard, run-of-the-mill, calculated military operation. It's a highly charged, retaliatory campaign. So to actually understand the debate we're about to look at, we have to recognize this starting point. It's a line drawn in the sand over American lives, promising a disproportionate response.
Okay, so let's dive into this. To make sense of the panel's arguments, we're going to break things down into four main pillars. First, the catalyst, U.S. troop casualties. Second, the strategy debate around airstrikes. Third, the shifting objectives regarding the Hormuz Strait. And finally, number 4, the ultimate dilemma, troops versus a deal.
Starting off with Section 1, the catalyst, U.S. troop casualties.
Because look, every geopolitical crisis really begins with the human cost. The panel kicked off their discussion by trying to sort through the fog of war. At first, there were these conflicting reports. Some people were mentioning 14 casualties, but the commentators quickly clarified that the administration confirmed 3 casualties. And they actually brought this down to a deeply personal level by naming 2 of them right there on air, Private Isabella Gonzalez and James Feehan from Hawaii. We're talking about a 19-year-old and a 25-year-old. The panel really emphasized that this is what our military is made of, young patriots. And this tragic loss of life, it's literally the center of gravity for this entire situation. It's exactly why these consecutive nights of strikes were launched in the first place, and honestly, it colors every single strategic decision moving forward.
Which brings us to Section 2, the strategy debate around airstrikes.
So, the panel wrestled with this fundamental question. Will airstrikes actually force submission? The commentators were pretty sharply divided on how effective a bombing campaign really is. The core of the debate is this. Can you just drop enough advanced weaponry from the sky to literally force a hostile regime to change its behavior and submit to your demands?
Well, one side of the panel argued absolutely yes. Pushing back against critics who doubt the bombings, one commentator confidently stated, "I do not believe that we will not bomb Iran to submission." The argument here is all about the sheer might and technological superiority of the American military. The thought process is, with our advanced weapons, pinpoint precision, and overwhelming force, we can systematically dismantle the adversary's capabilities, basically hitting them until they have absolutely no choice but to yield and change course.
But on the flip side, there was a really strong counter-argument. Another commentator pointed out that traditional political calculations, they are completely out the window here. Usually, politicians play it safe, right? They look at their 2- or 4-year election cycles, they try to avoid unpopular wars, especially around midterms. But the argument made on the panel is that the Iranian leadership fundamentally misread the president. They expected him to back down because of those standard political pressures. Instead, by killing these soldiers, they basically hit a hornet's nest. And the president is going to respond with incredible ferocity. So, from this perspective, the strikes aren't some neat, predictable path to submission. It's more like a cycle of escalating unpredictability.
And this brilliantly illustrates a much deeper philosophical divide that the panel highlighted. Like, why might overwhelming force actually fail to achieve submission? Well, they argued it comes down to the fundamental nature of the adversary. The panel framed this as a massive clash between a theocracy and rational capitalism. Think about it. Traditional deterrence assumes your enemy wants to preserve its economy, its infrastructure, its citizens' earthly lives. But the panel argued that logic totally fails against a regime that's motivated by the afterlife. One panelist bluntly said you literally cannot talk them into rational capitalism because they just don't place the same value on human life. If they are willing to absorb massive losses without even flinching, a traditional bombing campaign might not actually trigger a traditional surrender.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds. Shifting objectives, the Hormuz Strait.
The panel identified a massive strategic evolution happening right now. Before, the objective was crystal clear to the public: eliminate the capacity to develop nuclear weapons and take out their ballistic missiles. But the commentators pointed out that the entire battleground has shifted over the last few days. The nuclear conversation is kind of slowly being pushed off the table. Why? Because the adversary totally shifted the narrative. They did exactly what previous administrations were terrified of. They weaponized the Strait of Hormuz.
And if you're wondering why this matters, take a look at that 10 to 15% figure. That is the amount of the entire world's commerce that flows through these specific waterways, including connected routes like the Suez Canal.
That's huge. If those waters are weaponized and blocked off, the global economic stakes are absolutely staggering. The commentators stressed that the primary military objective now has to be keeping those straits open so trade can actually happen. It's this wild, high-stakes pivot from preventing a theoretical future nuclear threat to securing our immediate global supply chain today.
So the crucial point is in Section 4, the final dilemma: troops or a deal.
Here's the thing. If airstrikes can't force a submission, and you absolutely have to secure the Strait of Hormuz, what are your actual options left? The panel distilled this into a stark, almost agonizing binary choice. Column 1, American ground troops. Column 2, a diplomatic deal. The commentators came to this really grim consensus. If you want physical control of those waters, dropping bombs from the sky just isn't going to cut it forever. Eventually, you have to put boots on the ground to reassert control. The only alternative to that is sitting down at the table and hashing out a diplomatic agreement, and that carries its own heavy political costs, like unfreezing assets and making major concessions.
Let's zoom in on the reality of that first option for a second. The panel was incredibly blunt about what deploying ground troops actually means right now. First off, they noted that our allies, they are largely sitting this one out. That forces the U.S. to shoulder the entire burden unilaterally. But the most devastating cost, as they explicitly pointed out, is the human one. Sending in ground troops means risking more young lives, exactly like the 19 and 25-year-olds we talked about earlier. It literally means creating more newly minted Gold Star families and destroying more lives. It is a political and emotional toll that is just incredibly difficult to justify. But, as the panel pointed out, the adversary totally knows we don't want to put troops on the ground, which drastically undercuts our leverage.
Which leaves us hanging with this final, incredibly tough question. If airstrikes aren't enough against a regime that doesn't care about material loss, and if deploying ground troops is this unilateral, politically disastrous move that costs precious American lives, how do you actually resolve this strategic dilemma without reverting to a diplomatic deal that unfreezes funds? It's like the ultimate strategic paradox of modern warfare, a literal catch-22. The panel didn't have an easy answer, probably because there isn't one. I want you to keep this impossible dilemma in mind as you watch these global events unfold. Faced with these choices, what would you do? Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today. I'll see you next time.